Ambrose Evans-Pritchard is the international business editor for the UK Telegraph. A longtime opponent of the European Union's Constitution and Monetary Union, he was the Telegraph's Europe correspondent in Brussels from 1999 to 2004. He is the author of The Secret Life of Bill Clinton, The Unreported Stories. In this book, he elaborates on assertions that the Oklahoma City bombing was an FBI sting operation that went horribly wrong, that warnings by an ATF undercover agent were ignored, and that the U.S. Justice Department subsequently engaged in a cover-up of the entire matter. Ambrose's stories often attracted the ire of the Clinton regime. On his departure from Washington in 1997, a White House aide was quoted as saying, "That's another British invasion we're glad is over. The guy was nothing but a pain in the ass." He is relentless in his pursuit of truth and is one of the world's most credible voices on global economics. It's my distinct privilege to welcome Ambrose Evans-Pritchard to the Global Freedom Report. Welcome.
Hello, nice to be with you.
Sometimes the passage of time provides new perspectives. It's been 15 years since the Oklahoma City bombing and longer since the death of Vince Foster. Have you changed your views concerning these events or perhaps reinforced them over time?
When I left Washington 15 years ago, I sort of moved on, and I've had totally different roles, mostly covering Europe and more recently the global economy. And I'm just going to let that sit and essentially let history judge. What I tried to do was tell the story of many people I spoke to, the little people, if you like, who had tangled with the Clinton administration or had tangled with the Clinton machine in Arkansas back in the 80s, whose story hadn't really been told by the media in America. And I just wrote it all down, and I wrote it down in many, many articles I wrote working for the Telegraph. And then I wrote a book, and it's sort of for posterity, nearly all personal encounters with key witnesses and important events who had essentially been shut out of the US media. And it's down there as a historical record. People can go back to it if they want later, and I'll let history judge it. If all this starts coming out in subsequent congressional hearings or people start talking, all the better, then we'll get to the truth. I think people were really quite frightened about speaking openly about these events. And I have always felt that it would take 20 or 25, 30 years before the full details would really emerge. By the way, I don't retract anything. In the case of the Waco investigation, quite a lot has come to light that confirms the views of those who thought something awful had happened and there'd been a cover-up. That has been validated. In the case of the Oklahoma City bombing, quite a lot more has come to light because other people have been digging, and I enthusiastically encourage them. I'm not involved in any way. But they have come up with many, many new leads which tend to confirm what I thought, which was that it was a sting operation conducted by the FBI that went badly wrong. The FBI and the ATF tangled with each other, and it became a kind of undercover mess. And it wasn't deliberate. It was simply that they let matters sort of get out of hand, and then when the bomb accidentally went off, complete disaster, they'd lost control of it, and at that point they suppressed the truth. That was always my belief, and I talked to many, many people involved with that investigation and many of the families of the lost relatives in the Oklahoma City building who didn't believe the official story, and they had a lot of information that raised serious questions about it. So I can't be sure on this, but what we do know is they had an ATF undercover agent who penetrated a bombing conspiracy, a group of extremists who were planning to attack the Oklahoma City Federal Building. And when she reported this to her boss, and when it went up the chain, her investigation was shut down on orders of the FBI, and you have to wonder what was happening here. I think probably what was happening is the FBI had their own agent in there, and I think I know who it was, and these things were getting muddled. You had agents crossing each other's tripwires, and I suspect what occurred with the Oklahoma City bombing is the counterintelligence and the FBI were worried about something really big happening, possibly terrorists getting hold of weapons of mass destruction of some kind in the United States. They were running surveillance of this, and then this ATF sort of came in and mucked up their operation, and then they shut it down. But then having shut it down, they then lost control of their own thing, and that's where it went wrong.
Before we get into the economy, I'm just curious if you have any insights into why you were made to feel politically unwelcome. You were in Washington for a while, and I understand that there were those who were happy to see you gone. Was there some incident that occurred that pushed you over the threshold and said, you got to get out of here? What caused you to leave Washington?
No, nothing like that. I did 2 tours in Washington, so I was there for 7.5 years. It was a big part of my life. In a way, it became almost my hometown. But my tour of duty came to an end, and there was a successor appointed. And I always think in life you've got to move on anyway. You know, you do something, you're a journalist. There's a sort of natural length to these things.
So you weren't chased out of Washington on a rail, so to speak?
No, I mean, it became difficult, let's put it that way, but I wasn't chased out. I mean, it became difficult in part because I was taking on the whole establishment. It was sort of all right at first because I was writing stories about Clinton and some other stuff going on, and the Republicans quite liked it, and the kind of conservative press, or the more Republican-inclined media, quite liked it. And then I started digging deeper into things, and it became more sort of systemic. I could see problems in a lot of the big agencies of government that went beyond anything Clinton was doing, and it just seemed to be bad stuff had been going on for quite a long time, and they had not come clean about it, and journalists had backed away from it. And there was a whole set of stories to be told there that called into question the integrity of the American establishment. And that was a much more dangerous set of issues to investigate because you have no allies. You're on your own when you do that. There were the people. There were a lot of American people who helped me, and there was sort of talk radio who were supportive, and certain organizations were helpful. But when you're up against the whole establishment of the world's dominant superpower, you begin to feel a little bit lonely after a while, and it's not easy.
You are one of the more highly regarded when it comes to economic understanding and prognostication. I regularly post your commentaries on my websites. Would you care to give us a projection? What do you believe is going to happen to the economies of the United States and the European Union countries in 2011?
Well, there's this great mood of sort of optimism now developing that we've got a new cycle of global growth. It's going to run for several years. And it's going to kind of lift everybody up. It's going to lift Europe out of its debt crisis. It's going to lift America out of its property crisis. I am pretty skeptical about this. You have to remember that in the whole of the developed world, the US and Europe and Japan, interest rates are basically zero. They've used up all their monetary powder. The fiscal pedal is pushed to the floor because they're running deficits of about 10% of GDP in America. Colossal, same in Britain, almost the same in Japan. Almost as bad in Southern Europe. This is completely unsustainable. So you've had this absolutely massive stimulus thrown at the problem. At the end of the day, we've got a rather sickly recovery, which is in danger of faltering at any time, I would say. And at some point, it's already beginning to happen in certain countries in Europe and in Britain now, governments are going to have to tighten their belt a lot, and that's going to choke the economies. In certain cases like Spain and Ireland and Portugal, they're doing it so sharply that it's going to tip them straight back into recessions. If the governments don't do that, they're going to be punished by the global debt markets. You've now got this new concept of sovereign risk, which is something we haven't had in any major country since the 1930s. Suddenly the creditworthiness of major governments is in question. And you cannot any longer just assume that they will buy the debt. You can run deficits and they'll turn up at the auctions and cover it. They may not. And if they don't, then we're going to see interest rates spiraling upwards, and it's just going to short-circuit any recovery, and we go slap back into a crisis. We had a little hint of that a few weeks ago when Washington announced this deal between the Republicans and the White House, essentially renewing all the Bush tax cuts, but without adding some of President Obama's extra stimulus measures as well, and not putting forward any credible plan to contain the U.S. deficit through the next few years. What you saw was that borrowing costs for the U.S. government, the critical one being the 10-year U.S. Treasury yield, just rocketed. And some people are saying, well, this is a good sign because growth is improving, and I'm pretty skeptical about that. I think it was a sort of shudder by the global bond vigilantes that America's finally pushing its luck a bit too far. And that, I think, is a serious risk. So these developed countries are going to have to tighten their belt. And I don't think you can carry on doing more quantitative easing. I think that's been exhausted as a tool. The reaction globally to Ben Bernanke's second blast of quantitative easing was absolutely awful. The Chinese were furious, openly critical. The German Prime Minister called it clueless. These are major creditor powers, and when you've got top officials from the leading global creditor powers saying that kind of thing, you can't just ignore it. And China and Japan and the East Asian countries, I think, own jolly nearly 40% of the US federal debt at this point. So you've got to be careful. Japan is a close US ally, okay. China's not. And you've got to be a little careful how you handle this.
Even as you're mentioning it, it seems to me that the real problem with economies all over the world is that their health is based upon you going into debt. In other words, all these economies thrive when people owe money. I would call that like a design flaw. They would call me an idealist or something of that sort. I'm from more the Austrian School of Economics, pay as you go. Is there any place in the world at this point that is at least willing to look at a different system than this debt-based economic system that seems to be sweeping into all major countries on planet Earth?
The problem is, for about 50, 60 years, we've had this great big secular debt bubble building up in the Western world. And it's just been incrementally higher and higher share of GDP. The debt level has grown and grown and grown till it peaked at around 350% of GDP in America just before 2007, 2008. Almost exactly the same level, by the way, as it was in 1929. And there's a reason for that. And roughly it's the same as happened in much of Europe and in Japan. And there are all kinds of theories going around about, well, but this is money you mostly owe to yourself, or the world economy owes it to itself, therefore it's benign, it's just an accounting trick, and blah, blah, blah. I don't buy that. I think that ignores what Einstein called the fourth dimension of time, which is what economists call the intertemporal effect of this. You're drawing forward prosperity from the future. You're spending your future welfare, if you like. You're spending it now. You're drawing it forward, and eventually the future's going to arrive and hit you smack between the eyes, and that's what happened in 2007, 2008. That was the final reckoning for 50 or 60 years of debt buildup. Now, when you've had a huge debt buildup, it takes many, many, many years to slowly purge the system. Now, you can do it short, sharp, and brutal, which is what happened in many places in the 1930s, where you simply just have mass defaults. You just purge it. The trouble with that is you cause a depression, you destabilize political systems. In Europe, half the democracies collapsed. Most famously, obviously, Germany in 1931-32, when the deflation just ground the economy into the dust, and eventually Hitler came to power in the beginning of 1933. But in many other economies in Europe, they went through variants of this. So it's a very dangerous policy just to go for what Austrians call liquidation. I'm an Austrian, like you, in diagnosing the causes of this. You should never let it happen. But once it's happened, once you've let this huge debt build up, an Austrian cure just to sort of have mass defaults, I don't go along with that. I just think it's too dangerous.
What's the alternative, assuming that the status quo system is simply unacceptable and unworkable?
Well, I would propose something that's very unpopular, which is just you've got to, year after year, very slowly purge the debt and right the ship, bring things back into balance. And that means much slower growth than people are used to, much lower consumption than people are used to for a very, very long time. The problem is that politicians on either side of the Atlantic or in Japan have not faced up to this. They're still working from some assumption that they can return to the normal kinds of cycles of growth we had before.
And they absolutely refuse to cut one penny of any spending at all. And if that doesn't happen, there will be no change. I'd like to ask you about China, India, Japan. What do you expect from them in 2011? How are they going to fit into the developing global economic picture?
I'm very worried about Japan. Their public debt is just spiraling out of control. It's 225% of GDP, gross public debt, at the end of last year. And they're still running a deficit of 9 or 10% of GDP, the budget deficit. So they're piling on debt at a fantastic rate. The whole thing's compounding. They're in a debt compound trap already. They got away with it for a long time because they had these huge savings. And they drew down on these savings to sort of cushion the crisis. Basically, the pension funds were buying all the debt. The problem is the Japanese are now aging so fast. The population started contracting in absolute terms in 2005, the first country in the world where this happened. The first of many others that will follow shortly. Last year, Japan's population contracted by 120,000. And it's happening each year now. It's happening 100,000 a year. You're diminishing the economic base of the country, yet the debt level is exploding. Obviously, you